It's too late, my dear colleagues, to speak about de-escalation. Too late. The Russian president declared a war on the record. Should I play the video of your president?
This isn't called a war. This is called a special military operation in the Donbass.
There is no purgatory for war criminals. They go straight to hell, Ambassador.
I wanted to say in conclusion that we aren't being aggressive against the Ukrainian people, but against the junta that is in power in Kiev. There are no more speakers on the list. This meeting is adjourned.
And in the end, he quoted Churchill.
We will fight in the forest, in the fields, on the shores, in the streets. We will fight on the banks of the rivers, and we are looking for your help, for the help of the civilized countries.
More than 100,000 Ukrainian military officers have been killed so far.
I'm prepared to speak with Mr. Putin if, in fact, there is an interest in him deciding he's looking for a way to end the war. He hasn't done that yet. If that's the case, in consultation with my French and my NATO friends, I'll be happy to sit down with Putin to see what he has in mind.
Canadian author Margaret Atwood once said, "War is what happens when language fails. War is not inevitable. War is what happens when dialogue, when diplomacy fails." This might be true, but it's also true that wars are mostly intentional and driven by a desired outcome based on the strategic, political, or economic interest of its participants. Since February 2022, the world has been watching the events unfold in Ukraine with apprehension, dismay, and fear. The Russia-Ukraine war has shaken the foundations of our international peace and security system and what I would call the geopolitical foundations of the international system. The war in Ukraine is not about a Russian land grab or about the imperial dreams of a delusional Vladimir Putin who desires the restoration of the power and prestige once wielded by the old Soviet Empire. This war and its eventual outcome will be about Russia's place in global society and the rebalancing of the power in the world, dominated since the collapse of the Soviet Union by the United States of America. It is, one could argue, a war between the North and the South, between US hegemony and the emerging powers of the New World, Russia, China, India, the BRICS countries. A war between a unipolar world against a multipolar world. Much is certainly at stake here, not only for Russia and Ukraine, but for the entire world. Despite what you read in the mainstream media, this is not for Russia a war of choice. The image created by the mainstream media of a power-hungry and mad dictator in the person of Vladimir Putin is simply disingenuous, wrong, and to be honest, a playbook familiar to most who care to think. In my own not so important or relevant career as a journalist, I have learned the importance of considering the other side of the story, the side mostly ignored by the popular media, who in most cases are nothing but stenographers for professional institutional spokespeople, spin doctors. Which brings me to today's program. During the last few days, we've seen some significant movement towards a recalibration of this war. A telephone call initiated by the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz to the Kremlin, during which, according to the Russian readout of the meeting, Putin showed no signs to back off. A slip of the tongue by the President of the European Union, Ursula von der Leyen, in which she admitted that 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers have lost their lives in the conflict, and of course, President Joe Biden's somewhat reluctant utterance that he might be prepared to sit down for a talk with Vladimir Putin, signaling at least for some a tiny crack in Washington's armor and maybe, one would hope so, a first step towards peace, towards a dialogue. What Biden will hear from Putin will be a familiar story. It will be familiar. It will, in fact, be, at least in part, exactly the same words that Vladimir Putin has now for some 20 years used in his attempt to get Washington around the table to talk about Russia, at least from Russia's point of view, security concerns. that in the last few weeks, I have spoken to 4 people outside the mainstream media who can tell President Biden exactly what he can expect to hear from the Russian president.
There is a popular narrative that has been developed and systematically disseminated across the West. This narrative says, and has been saying, by the way, since 24 February, that Ukraine is winning. Ukraine is winning. Ukraine is winning. The Russians have lost. The Russians are incompetent. The Russians are stupid. The Russian equipment doesn't work. Tens of thousands of Russians are dying. They're in ruins. Well, this is all nonsense.
This is a proxy war between the United States and Russia. The Ukrainians are dying, but it's the U.S. weaponry, and it's the U.S. intelligence, and it's the U.S. operations, it's the U.S. funding that is at the essence of this war.
I think it's pretty much a lose-lose situation. If there's any silver lining, it might be that yes, this infrastructure for European security would make the Europeans perhaps at last realize that they need their own security system.
This war will end on Russia's terms. There will be no negotiated settlement. Ukraine doesn't have any cards to play. The poker game's over. It closed on April 1st.
The prayers of the entire world are with the people of Ukraine tonight as they suffer an unprovoked and unjustified attack by Russian military forces. President Putin has chosen a premeditated war that will bring a catastrophic loss of life and human suffering.
When it comes to this war in Ukraine, this has been brewing for 3 decades as well, because the terms of Gorbachev ending the Soviet Warsaw Pact military alliance was that NATO would not take advantage of that, but would also stay where it was. The phrase that was used to Gorbachev was, NATO will not move 1 inch to the east. Of course, as soon as the Soviet Union ended, the United States neocon said, we can do what we want. We don't have to honor any agreement, and they started NATO enlargement. First to Central Europe, probably acceptable and understandable, though a lie. I wouldn't have done it. But to Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, these were countries that had been dominated by the Soviet Union. They're not close to Russia. They weren't any direct threat to Russia to have them as part of NATO. But then, starting in the 2000s with George W. Bush Jr., who really was the neocon administration par excellence, with Cheney as his vice president, the one who made the Iraq War, for example, they enlarged NATO to 7 more countries: Romania, Bulgaria, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, Slovakia, and Slovenia. Now, that's coming pretty close to Russia, and Russia kept saying, don't do this. It's provocative. You told us you never would. You're getting to our borders. You're threatening our security. And then in 2008, George Bush actually did the horror, though privately, of the Europeans, said, we're going to expand NATO to Ukraine and to Georgia. Now, if you look at a map, and I hope your listeners do look at a map, if the NATO alliance expanded to Georgia and Ukraine, the idea was and would be to encircle Russia in the Black Sea, because you'd have NATO in Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia. You'd actually encircle the Russian naval fleet, and as U.S. neocon strategists said, that would end Russia as any kind of even regional power. It couldn't project any kind of power, even naval, in the Eastern Mediterranean. That was the idea. The Russians were beside themselves, and Putin said in the 2008 Bucharest NATO summit to Bush, to his face, if you do this, we will take Crimea, because that is, for us, core security. Americans are incredibly arrogant at this governmental level. They believe they don't have to listen to anybody. But, there was a breathing space in 2010 because a pro-Russian president was elected in Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych.
Yeah.
And he said, we should be neutral. We don't want to be caught in a trap between the United States and Russia. We will be neutral.
Yeah.
But that's not good enough for America. You're either with us or you're against us.
Up until the very December of 2021, before the Russian invasion in February, there were proposals that Russia was putting on the table, basically saying, help, stop, let's sit down, let's talk about these things. And the US and the head of NATO just summarily dismissed all of those entreaties by Russia to talk. And then we had the February invasion.
Putin was trying to work with the West, literally reaching out and saying, what can we do? You got this expanding NATO thing happening. Why don't you just invite us in? We'll be part of NATO. Then you don't have to expand anymore. Now we're there. We don't need to fear each other. The CIA had a master plan of breaking Russia up into its constituent parts to weaken it so Russia could never again rise up to the level of the Soviet Union. And Putin is aware of this, and he's still willing to work with the West, saying, okay, we know what you're trying to do, but let's work together. No one did it. And you see the frustration first manifested itself in April 2005 when he gave a speech to the Federal Council. And that's the one that gets misquoted. That's the speech where he said that one of the greatest geopolitical disasters of the last century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. First of all, he said one of. He didn't say the, but everybody says the Soviet, boom, as if Putin is saying, woe is me. But then they never mentioned the next part, which is because overnight tens of millions of Russians found themselves homeless, without a home, with no one to care for them. That was the catastrophe. It wasn't the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was the human cost of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it was his mission to take care of the Russian people, the Russian nation. In 2007, he had enough. The West wasn't going to cooperate, wasn't going to work in a collegial fashion. And that's when he called out the West at the Munich Security Conference. One of the greatest pieces of geopolitical rhetoric in modern age. And most Americans ignore it. Most Westerners ignore it. It's genius, not just his statement, but the question and answer period where he literally made the Western members in the audience twitch uncomfortably in their seats. Watching John McCain and John Kerry stare into the distance it's beautiful. But then you follow, everything he warned about there became true. 2008, the invitation to Ukraine and Georgia by NATO to join. The memorandum written in February 2009 by William Burns, a name familiar today because he's the director of the CIA. At the time, he was the U.S. ambassador to Russia. The title of this memorandum was "Niet means Niet." Let me just point one thing out. The only reason why we know about this memorandum is because of a man named Julian Assange, who's still in prison today for daring to tell the world, release information to the world about the reality of what's going on. So the only reason why people are going to know about what I'm about to say isn't because Scott Ritter's a wonderful researcher and or the State Department is honest. It's because Julian Assange released documents about U.S. diplomacy that the U.S. State Department doesn't want anybody to know about.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons why is because William Burns in this memorandum said, "Niet means niet, no means no." When the Russians say that Ukraine is a red line, they mean it. And he talked about the consequences, and I'll just boil it down. If the United States continues to pursue the expansion of NATO to include Ukraine, then Russia will have no choice but to engage in military action, and Ukraine will lose, at a minimum, the Donbass and Crimea. February 2009, he wrote this. February 2009, he put it on the table and he said, this is what's at stake here. These are the consequences.
Yeah.
We ignored him. We ignored everything. We pushed. Putin tried to make peace. We orchestrated a coup in Kiev in February 2014. I know people take contention with that. I have no use for those people who say it wasn't a coup. Then you don't know anything about research, history, common sense, logic. It was a coup d'etat undertaken by the West. One has to listen to, again, things they don't want us to hear, but they're there. Victoria Nuland's intercepted conversation with the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. Listen to how, and this is before Viktor Yanukovych fled. While he's still president, they're talking about who is going to be the future leaders of Ukraine, because that was the sole purpose of Maidan, a violent coup d'etat that killed scores of people to put in place this ultra-nationalist group of neo-Nazi worshiping, Stepan Bandera embracing thugs who then turned their genocidal mindset against the Russians of East Ukraine.
Yeah.
What happened? Crimea was taken by the Russians and to protect the Russian interests. William Burns warned us about that. And then the Donbass rose up and said, no, we don't support the coup. We support the former legitimate president. Now have a near civil war. From that point on, Vladimir Putin, now if Vladimir Putin was the evil man that they say he was, he would have absorbed the Donbass immediately when they asked for independence. But Putin was pushing for the territorial integrity of Ukraine to be respected.
Yeah.
He asked for the Minsk I Accords. That didn't happen. Minsk II came in. Germany, France, claimed to be part of this. The United States claimed they wanted to support it. Turns out it was a sham, but it wasn't a sham because Russia was playing a game. It was a sham because everybody else was playing a game. Putin was seeking a diplomatic solution from day one. Up until the very end, December of last year, he put draft treaties in the hands of NATO and the United States saying, please, please, please don't do what you're about to do. We need peace. Here is a European security framework. Don't ignore us. Talk to us. I know you're not going to be happy what's in the document. That's okay. Sit down at the table. Let's talk about this. Let's take this seriously. Let's make sure we exhaust every venue possible short of war before war becomes the only option available. And the United States didn't believe him. Thought he was bluffing. Said, no, we're going to sanction you. You must be afraid. Vladimir Putin said, well, I have no choice. We get a special military operation, and the rest is history.
Now, we say publicly, of course, as we always do, that Mr. Putin is evil, the government is evil, the society is evil, corrupt, criminal, because we do that whenever we go to war with anybody. We immediately say, well, we're dealing with Stalin or Hitler or some version of it. That, of course, is not true. Our society is hardly perfect. Theirs is not perfect. There are very few perfect societies of which I am aware, but the notion that we should go to war to change those societies, which is what we've been doing for 30 years, is sheer lunacy. It's always failed.
This is just the latest neoconservative debacle of the U.S. neoconservatives. The neoconservatives are the group that took over U.S. foreign policy 30 years ago at the end of the Soviet Union. This neoconservative group said, oh, okay, our rival is gone. We now are the sole superpower. We run the world. We are the hegemon, to use the term that the international relations types use. Yeah. Or as the military in the U.S. says, we have full spectrum dominance. Now, the idea was 30 years ago already, we can basically do what we want. And they have tried in Iraq. They have tried in Syria. They have tried in Libya. They have tried in Afghanistan. And what they've tried to do is to say the U.S. runs the show. It fails all the time. When it comes to this war in Ukraine, this has been brewing for 3 decades as well, because the terms of Gorbachev ending the Soviet Warsaw Pact military alliance was that NATO would not take advantage of that, but would also stay where it was. The phrase that was used to Gorbachev was, NATO will not move 1 inch to the east. Of course, as soon as the Soviet Union ended, the United States neocon said, we can do what we want. We don't have to honor any agreement. And they started NATO enlargement.
If you cannot sleep because of Russia-Ukrainian conflict, there are some advices to calm you down. First, imagine that this is happening in Africa. Imagine this is happening in the Middle East. Imagine Ukraine is Palestine. Imagine Russia is the United States.
Suppose that Mexico said, you know, we're a sovereign country. We want to have a military alliance with China because we're not so happy about the way the U.S. proceeds with its war on drugs or anything else, or the refugee problem. So we're going to have a military alliance with China. And you think the United States would say, yeah, that's great. You're a sovereign country. We're so happy for you. Congratulations. The U.S. would invade in a nanosecond.
I also think that we saw in December a peace plan that Russia put forward saying, here are some of the issues that we urgently need to discuss. And the fact that that wasn't taken seriously at all, it was just totally dismissed by the US and the West. There were two separate ones. One was to the European countries, and the other was to the US, both dismissed. I think gave Putin the understanding that there was not going to be any chance of negotiations. I think that it was a terrible mistake to go in, but I understand the frustration on the part of Russians of not being able to get the attention of the West to seriously discuss these issues.
In 2008 in Budapest, I don't know how anybody could have missed it. Certainly the Germans did not miss it at the time. Mr. Putin made it very clear that there is a red line. You cross into Ukraine and you create a threat to us, we will react. And of course, that's what happened. However, his reaction back in February is very different from what everybody, including me, expected. He gave very strict guidance to his commanders that they were to go in small numbers on a very broad front to avoid killing as many people as possible, avoid infrastructure damage to the extent that they could, because what he was really interested in doing was getting a negotiation going where certain things would happen. Number one, the Ukrainians would accept neutrality and not join NATO. Number two, the two so-called breakaway republics would be recognized in terms of equal rights for Russians who speak Russian and so forth. And for that matter, that's embedded in the Minsk Accords, which were never enforced, that all of the Russians living in eastern Ukraine would have equal rights before the law like the Ukrainians. And then finally, that Ukraine would drop this nonsense about Crimea, recognize Russia's legitimate control of Crimea. Those were the demands. And so things progressed very slowly. And he encountered this extraordinary military resistance that I don't think he expected. I think he thought that the Ukrainian government would be interested in avoiding the conflict, the damage, the destruction. I think he thought that we and the other NATO capitals would be equally interested in avoiding the damage and the destruction. He was wrong. And I think he finally gave up at the end of April when the talks at Istanbul broke down, because at those talks, Mr. Zelensky's representative said, look, we can live with neutrality. We can come, that's something we can live with. We need to discuss the two republics, but, certainly, you have some valid points there. And, we really don't want to talk about Crimea right now, but we can talk about that in the future.
Yep.
Then suddenly the call came in from Washington, presumably, and said, forget it, absolutely out of the question. If you want our support, and we will support you to the bitter end, quote unquote, then you must continue to fight. And at that point, Putin, who had never employed more than 20% of the Russian ground force in eastern Ukraine, finally recognized that the game had changed, so to say. In other words, he was in a very different strategic position from the one that he anticipated. Because initially, his general staff and his military commanders wanted to do things differently, and he refused to do it because he was absolutely convinced that everyone was equally interested in avoiding trouble, avoiding destruction. So he then begins to change direction. This starts in May and June, and his generals come back to him and say, look, if you want to end this war, put it to bed once and for all, we're going to have to go back and do what we wanted to do in February. We need a large-scale Russian military offensive. We need to knock out the power, knock out the fuel supports, knock out the movement of equipment and weapons from the West into Ukraine. We've got to take decisive action, and we're going to need several 100,000 soldiers to do this. We don't want Western Ukraine. That's never been a goal. They never wanted to cross the Dnieper River. But he did decide, yes, Odessa is a Russian-speaking city, always has been. We should retake Odessa. Kharkov was always a Russian-speaking city. We should retake Kharkov. And the southern Ukraine, the Donbass, where they're sitting right now. He finally said, yes, we'll do that. So they went ahead and they did those things, but then they came back and said, look, we still need more troops if we're going to go to Kharkov and Odessa. So then the decision was made to bring in large numbers of these volunteer forces, the Chechens, the Wagner Group, along with large numbers of Russian organizations. You have the Kuban Cossack Host, which is now there, which incidentally, they're all descended from Ukrainians that were pushed into the Kuban 300 years ago. They've been fighting in southern Ukraine, about 60, 70,000 of them. And they were playing playing is the wrong word, but conducting a very elastic defense. In other words, defend what you think is worth defending, abandon what isn't. And that brought us to where we are today. And those defenses then were strengthened over time. And the Ukrainians desperately continued to attack. And the Ukrainian army is now bled white, literally. They've had over 100,000 killed, 400,000 wounded. Their hospitals, their aid stations are overflowing with horribly crippled and damaged human beings. And they've begun recruiting at the point of a gun to try and replace the losses. But the initial force of roughly 600,000, which we had trained and equipped for 8 years to fight Russia and ultimately to attack it, that's gone. Those people are either killed or wounded. Some have survived, but the majority haven't. But the Ukrainians have continued to force people into action. And of course, they've been joined by others. Thousands of Poles, Polish soldiers in Ukrainian uniform, mercenaries from various parts of the world. As I understand it, we now have 70 fighters that were part of ISIS who have joined us.
I was going to ask that. Yes, I even heard ISIS.
It's bizarre, but this is one of these deals where you take the position, I guess, in Washington that my enemy's enemy is my friend. So the bottom line is this thing has gone way beyond anything that anybody anticipated. And the Russians have now stepped back and they are preparing an offensive that will be probably unleashed, I suspect, late November, mid to late November, December. It could come later, but I doubt it. Preferably when the ground is frozen. And at the same time, they continue to strike at the infrastructure. This man, I guess it's Klitschko, the mayor of Kiev, he gave a speech yesterday and said that if we wanted to prevent the Ukrainian population from freezing to death, then we'd better send large numbers of generators and blankets because the entire power grid has been destroyed now. Remember, at the beginning of this whole thing, Putin would not do these things. He refused to. He said, no, these are our Slavic brothers. They are Orthodox Christian Slavs like us. We don't want to murder them, kill them, destroy them. We want to get along with them. We don't want to govern Ukraine, but we want equal rights for our Russian brothers who are living inside Ukraine. I mean, this is very different from what everybody in the West hears.
What is the importance of this war for the Americans? What's in it for you?
I think if you look at it in the larger geopolitical structure, there's nothing in it for the American people, but for U.S. interests, whether they're energy interests or the weapons business, which is big business in the United States. There is an interest in cutting Europe off from the Russia and putting it back squarely in the realm of the United States as its major trading partner, and the U.S. also being concerned that the main adversary that our government is telling the people is the Chinese. So weakening Russia in order to not have Russia be a strong partner for China. So I think in the geopolitical level, it's all of those machinations to maintain U.S. hegemony in the world and ultimately to confront China. There's also, you see how the Western energy interests, particularly the United States, has been trying to take advantage of the sanctions against Russian energy and get in there quickly to fill these markets that were being supplied by the Russians.
At enormously high prices.
Yes. And you also see how the U.S., in the particularly the last two administrations, has been pressuring the Europeans to spend more of their money on militarism, to, quote, fulfill the NATO goal of having 2% of the gross national product at least going towards the military. Now, if you look at what that means buying U.S. weapons.
Mm-hmm.
And this has been a tremendous boon to the U.S. weapons industry, not only because of all the money that the U.S. is spending now to send these weapons to Ukraine, but also because the Europeans are now spending hundreds of billions of dollars more on weapons that they will be buying mostly from the United States, because within NATO, there has to be a interoperability to be able to have the militaries work together. So, those are some reasons I would say that the U.S. is posing this as such an important security interest to the American people and to the West, and saying it even in the terms that, of course, that, we are defending democracy in Ukraine so that Russia will not take over the Baltic states and expand. This is about worldwide democracy. But I think we have to put it much more in the terms of this is about U.S. trying to hold on to its quickly fading hegemony.
На что хотел бы обратить внимание? Они должны были бы понять, что уже проиграли с самого начала нашей специальной военной операции, потому что ее начало означает и начало кардинального слома миропорядка по-американски. Это начало перехода от либерально-глобалистского американского эгоцентризма к действительно многополярному миру. Миру, основанному не на придуманных кем-то для себя эгоистических правилах, за которыми нет ничего, кроме как стремления к гегемонии. Не на лицемерных двойных стандартах, а на международном праве, на подлинном суверенитете народов и цивилизаций, на их воле жить своей исторической судьбой, своими ценностями и традициями, и выстраивать сотрудничество на основе демократии, справедливости и равноправия. И надо понимать, что этот процесс остановить уже невозможно.
More than 100,000 Ukrainian military officers have been killed so far.
I'm prepared to speak with Mr. Putin if, in fact, there is an interest in him deciding he's looking for a way to end the war.
If he wants good news, he needs to get on the phone, call Moscow, and ask for an immediate ceasefire and offer to convene talks, and that we will host and support these talks wherever they are held. We can join them, but we can certainly support them if he would prefer that we not be part of them. But I would go first and foremost to the idea of arranging a ceasefire. I think Americans would like that. Keep in mind that very few Americans are probably interested or even find Ukraine on the map. It's just something foreign, as is most things beyond the borders of the United States. I mean, if you move beyond the borders of the United States, Americans just aren't focused there. They're focused on what's happening at home. And you know that we have an enormous problem with the economy, inflation, widespread criminality in the large cities, open borders, millions of people pouring in that we don't know any of them. We haven't vetted them. So it would be an easy win for him. But I don't see any evidence that he will do that. In fact, the evidence is strongly in favor of confrontation with Russia, which I think is both unnecessary, pointless, and self-defeating.
I don't think that there's anything in it for the United States compared to a truly cooperative world where we're actually solving global problems. The United States has spent trillions and trillions of dollars on these awful wars that it has fought. And like you say, it gets away with them. There is impunity. One of my colleagues at Columbia wrote a wonderful paper, a little disturbing, about the fact that the United States overthrew around 30 governments in the Americas in the 20th century. And I've watched some of those coups with my own eyes, by the way, because the CIA is an unaccountable organization. And since it operates in secrecy, it's never held to account for blunder after blunder after blunder. But we've overthrown governments, we've destabilized societies. You know, in the African context, the CIA thought it was really important that Lumumba be assassinated rather than to have a true popular leader in the Congo after independence, that kind of thing, putting the country on a tailspin for decades afterwards, as if this is somehow good for America and so on. You know, there are people who argue the line that, well, this is for the U.S. military-industrial complex or to keep vital resources and so on. There may be motivations like that, but it's so stupid because it does not deliver anything of benefit or security for the American people, actually. But it is a mindset. The mindset is real. I know the mindset. And the mindset, by the way, if anybody plays the board game, which was popular in my youth in the United States, the game of Risk, that's a board game where you have a world map. And the goal is to have your piece on every place in the world. That's how you win. That is the American mindset, I'm sorry to tell you, which is that we're not safe unless we have military bases everywhere. We already have them in 85 countries. 800 overseas military bases. It's not making us safe. It's making the world unstable. Yeah. And this is just a category error and a conceptual blunder, but it is the neocon agenda. I wrote a book in 2019 called A New Foreign Policy Beyond American Exceptionalism. I can tell you it was not a bestseller. I don't know how many people read it, but its effects I don't feel, because basically it was saying this approach, this unipolar approach, this idea that America is the one country that gets to write all the rules, this is not going to deliver even for the American people, much less for the rest of the world.
Yeah. Let me talk about the here and now and the situation on the ground. It's winter in Europe, as you know, winter in Ukraine. Putin's soldiers are mobilized, they trained, ready to move, are on the move. 40% of the Ukraine is without electricity. Some say that Europe will face within the next month or two the possibility of a stream of refugees. Some people say 3, 5, up to 8 million refugees. The European economy is shaky, to say the least. There are signs of war fatigue, that there are cracks in NATO. Putin doesn't trust the West. Here's my question. As you see the situation on the ground right now, once again, is there überhaupt at all any chance whatsoever that the Ukrainians can, in some way or another form, win this war as the media seems to insist they must? Any chance?
I would never bet against Russia losing this war, ever. You could offer me whatever odds you wanted. I would never bet against Russia losing this war. Russia will not lose this conflict. The question now is, how do you define victory? Because it's no longer, this war will end on Russia's terms. There will be no negotiated settlement. Ukraine doesn't have any cards to play. The poker game's over. It closed on April 1st in Istanbul, when Ukraine could have got a deal at that time. Putin was looking for a way out because his gambit failed. And he was sitting there saying, okay, let's close this thing down. Let's keep Donbass, Crimea, but we're done with this. We tried the quick and easy thing. It didn't work. We only have 200,000 troops. We're not ready. Ukraine withdrew under pressure from the West. It was Boris Johnson that came in and said, no deal.
Yeah.
And now the Russians have sacrificed a lot and they've mobilized, and this will end on Russia's terms. The only negotiation will resemble that which took place in Tokyo Bay in September 1945, when the Japanese had to stand before a table with the American conquerors and sign the terms dictated by the United States. Russia will dictate terms. So it's up to Russia what Russia wants out of this. I, you know, I can't sit here and say with full confidence what I know what Russia says it wants. It wants demilitarization. That means that all NATO influence is eliminated from the Ukrainian military. Since the Ukrainian military is the de facto proxy of NATO today, it means the total destruction of the Ukrainian military.
Yeah.
So either Russia is going to kill them all, and Russia is prepared to do so now. There's no more soft glove approach. The Russians are in the business of killing Ukrainians, and business is good. They're slaughtering them on the front, and they're going to kill them more. 10 to 15 divisions are showing up very soon. Ukraine's got nothing to respond. Russia is taking out at will. Russia can attack Ukraine top to bottom, left to right at will. There is no air defense system in Ukraine worthy of the name. It's, you know, they shoot down 1 or 2 missiles, everything else gets hit, and Russia can do whatever it wants in Ukraine right now in terms of taking out critical infrastructure. You know, the key here for Russia is how to manage, because let me put this too. Europe and the United States sought to impose massive sanctions on Russia. Sanctions that weren't designed to hurt Vladimir Putin and the oligarchs and all that. Yes, they were. Sanctions designed to hurt the Russian people, to starve the Russian people, to have their livelihoods eliminated through economic collapse, to bring about domestic calamity in Russia. So if you're a Russian citizen, you need to wake up to this reality that the West is not this warm and fuzzy thing. It is a brutal, thuggish entity that sought to bring harm to you, to deny your ability to raise your children, deny your ability to have a job, deny your ability to have health care, pension, everything. They wanted to crush Russia. So beware the West, because soon the only hope you have is Russian goodwill, because your economy is going down. It's collapsing, not because of anything Russia did, because of what you did, what we did in seeking to isolate Russia, sanction Russia. It has failed. Russia has emerged with a very solid economy while Europe is suffering, and Europe's going to suffer egregiously. So Russia is going to play whatever cards they can, up to and including, because there's a reason behind the madness. It's not just about taking out electric power grids to curtail the movement of military forces and command and control. This is about destroying a nation. Russia isn't in the business of saving Ukraine anymore. Russia's in the business of destroying Ukraine, and in the process, bringing harm to Europe. Russia will, I believe, generate an economic emergency, humanitarian emergency in Ukraine that requires millions of people to flee for their lives. If they stay in their frozen cities, they will die. There will be no food, no water, no electricity, no health care, nothing. This is a tragedy, but the West brought it on themselves. And now millions of people are going to flee to the West, and the West is going to have to deal with that problem. Yeah. And suddenly, when this is all said and done, not only will the Russians have destroyed the Ukrainian military, there's also denazification, by the way, which everybody poo-poos in the West. There is a Nazi problem in Ukraine. There won't be when Russia finishes. That is pretty much a guarantee. If you don't understand Russia and how much they hate Nazi ideology and how sickened they are that it has reborn itself rebirthed itself in Ukraine under Western protection. If you think that Stepan Bandera Avenue is still going to be Stepan Bandera Avenue when this is done, if you think there's going to be monuments to Stepan Bandera in Lvov in Western Ukraine, you don't know Russia. Russia will denazify Ukraine, and the cost of that denazification will be horrific. The gloves are off. Russia's not committing war crimes. Everybody's going, this is a war crime. Really? Take a look at what the United States did to Iraq in 1991. I was a part of that. We took out their infrastructure. We took out their electric. We took out their water. We took out it because it's all dual use. Look what we did to Serbia. We shut the lights out in Serbia in 1999. NATO did. Russia's just doing it better. They're doing it bigger. And it should scare the hell out of the West. Yeah. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that word on radio, so I apologize. But it should scare the heck out of Europe, because I think Europe needs to wake up that they're, before the grace of God, go us. Meaning, you want to fight with Russia. This is what war is about, ladies and gentlemen. Europe forgot that. Europe forgot what it's like to have cities torn apart, populations dislocated, death and suffering on a large scale, economies malfunctioning, Welcome to war, Europe. You wanted it, you got it, you pay the price, and ain't no Russian shedding a tear for you. But you know what the sad thing is? Russians are crying for them, because Russians are good people. Russians are upset about this. This is ripping Russia's soul apart because they're not the evil, robotic, automaton, Mordor, orc nation that they've been told. This is a nation of deep culture, deep religion. Religion. These people are religious and they take their religion seriously and they believe in doing good to fellow humans. They don't want to be doing what's happening right now. This war is ripping them apart. But as I said when we at the break, I'm attracted to Rick Atkinson's trilogy where he talked about the transition of the American draft military from isolationist depression area men who wanted to be at home with their families. They didn't want to go to war. They didn't believe in this war. And the transition from that into this army of killers, not rapists and murderers, killers who realize the only way you're going home is by killing the Nazis in front of you and kill them without mercy, slaughter them. And I think the Russian army right now, they've got 300,000 guys mobilized who don't want to go to war. They don't want to go to war. But they are, and they recognize that the quickest path home is by killing every Ukrainian soldier in front of them, slaughtering them. Now, if they put up their hands, they're not going to murder them like the Ukrainians murdered Russian soldiers. They're going to take them prisoner. And they've proven that. Tens of thousands of Ukrainians have been taken prisoner, and then they're returned. They have medical care and all this kind of stuff. But this war is going to get ugly, ugly, ugly. And Europe is to blame. America is to blame. This is not Russia's fault. Just because Russia has been compelled to behave in this manner, don't blame Russia. They didn't want this. They didn't want to do this. They sought to avoid this.